By the time the old man placed the single envelope in the middle of the Christmas table, he had already decided to say goodbye to his family without speaking a single word out loud. The paper was thin, the ink was shaky, but every line inside was a verdict on the years they had slowly let him fade into the background. In that quiet suburban home outside Cincinnati, Ohio, the twinkling lights and cinnamon candles lied. This wasn't really a celebration. It was the night Henry Caldwell chose to leave his family with the truth they had refused to see. Henry was 78, with shoulders that had once been broad from 4 decades at a metalworks factory that didn't even exist anymore. His dark green sweater sagged a little on his frame, the fabric clinging to a body that still remembered every overtime shift he'd worked to pay for this very house. The glow of the Christmas tree in the corner painted soft colors over his lined face, but nothing could soften the heaviness in his eyes. Home, he thought, had disappeared the day his late wife's laughter vanished from their kitchen. Across the table, his son Mark scrolled distractedly on his phone, blue light reflected in his glasses like he was staring into another world entirely. Mark wore a crisp white button-up, the kind that screamed conferences and deadlines, not oil changes and garage lessons like the ones his father used to give him. His wife, Vanessa, checked the timer on the oven for the 3rd time, her diamond bracelet catching the light as if it were the true star of the evening. Their teenage daughter, Lily, half listened to music through one earbud, her fingers tapping out a rhythm on her phone case that had nothing to do with family or Christmas. Henry watched them with a quiet ache, his calloused thumb tracing the rim of his water glass in slow circles. They weren't bad people, he reminded himself again and again. Just busy, just tired, just swallowed by a life that never stopped buzzing, flashing, demanding their attention. Still, he couldn't ignore the chill in the room that had nothing to do with the December wind slipping through the window panes. It was the cold of being tolerated instead of treasured, of being an obligation instead of a blessing. For weeks, he had listened to the way their voices changed when they thought he couldn't hear, and each small change had carved another line into his heart. The long sigh when he asked for help reaching something in the cabinet. The tight patience in the, "Sure, Dad," that really meant, "Do you have to?" The way Vanessa had whispered in the kitchen, "It's just for the holidays, Mark. We can't do this all year." Not knowing, Henry stood in the hallway, clutching his late wife's shawl so hard his knuckles turned white. On the dining table, a perfect Christmas centerpiece sparkled with fake snow and bright red berries that would never rot or bruise. Beside it lay the envelope, plain, white, a little wrinkled from the bus ride over from the senior home. Henry had held it so tightly that the edges had softened, the paper warmed by the nervous heat of his palm. There were no decorations on the outside, just 3 simple words in shaky blue ink. "For my family." No one had asked what it was. No one had really noticed it at all. The television in the living room played a Hallmark Christmas movie no one was actually watching, all soft problems and guaranteed happy endings. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the quiet Ohio cul-de-sac in white and turning the streetlights into glowing halos. Inside, the only real weather was happening in Henry's chest, a slow, heavy storm made of disappointment, love, and something dangerously close to resignation. The envelope at his elbow felt less like paper and more like a loaded question. "Are you sure you still matter here?" He thought of other Christmases, years when this table stood in his own small house and Marie, his wife, would hum carols off-key while burning the first batch of cookies. He remembered Mark as a boy in footed pajamas, racing down the stairs, diving into his arms before even glancing at the gifts. He remembered promises made in a hospital corridor, when Marie's hands were cold, but her eyes were still fierce. "Don't let this family grow cold after I'm gone, Henry. Promise me you'll keep them close." Somewhere between that promise and tonight, something had slipped through his fingers like snow. Mark finally cleared his throat, setting his phone down as if that simple act proved he was fully present. "So, Dad," he began, reaching for the bowl of mashed potatoes, "how's the room at the senior place? They treating you okay?" The question sounded casual, almost thoughtful, but the word place cut Henry more deeply than if Mark had called it what it felt like most nights lately. A waiting room for people whose lives no longer fit into anyone else's schedule. Henry forced a small smile that never reached his tired eyes. "They treat me fine," he said, the phrase worn out from repeating it to nurses, neighbors, and the bathroom mirror. "Everyone's busy. They do what they can." He took a sip of water to steady the tremor in his hand. "I'm just grateful you invited me tonight." He didn't add that the invitation had only come after Lily had asked at the last minute, "Are we even going to have Grandpa here for Christmas or what?" Vanessa slid a basket of warm rolls nearer to him, the gesture smooth and automatic. Of course we invited you, Henry," she said without quite looking him in the eye. "Your family." The word sounded pretty and polished, like something from a greeting card, but it floated over the table with no weight, no roots. She was already thinking about the dishes, the holiday sales, and the photos she'd post later, captions about family time, over a picture where no one would really notice the quiet man at the edge of the frame. Lily, maybe sensing a tension she couldn't fully name, finally tugged out her remaining earbud. "Grandpa, did you bring anything?" she asked, her gaze drawn at last to the envelope resting near his plate. "Like one of your stories or something?" "You always have good stories." For a fragile second, Henry felt something warm flutter in his chest. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe someone at this table still wanted more than his silence and his polite gratitude. "Yes," he said softly, resting his trembling hand on top of the envelope. "I brought something for all of you." The words felt heavier than they sounded, as if each one carried years of unsent letters and unsaid truths. His eyes moved from Lily to Mark to Vanessa, measuring their distracted expressions, their half-smiles, their strained kindness. In the reflection on his water glass, he saw himself as they likely saw him now, old, fragile, and above all, temporary. What the envelope truly held was more than paper. Inside, folded with the care of someone handling glass, was a letter he had written slowly over the past month, each line part confession and part farewell. There was also a copy of a document he'd signed in a quiet office not far from the senior home, one that changed the future of everything his family thought they were entitled to. And tucked in the back, barely visible, was a faded photograph from Christmas morning, 1987, when love in this family had felt simple, loud, and unquestioned. As Vanessa carried in the turkey, Mark stood to help her, bumping the table just enough to make the envelope slide a few inches. It stopped directly in front of his plate, like the universe itself had grown impatient with their avoidance. "What's this?" Mark asked, picking it up between his fingers with the same casual curiosity he'd give a piece of junk mail. He turned it over once, twice, oblivious to the way Henry's breath hitched in his chest and his fingers curled tighter around his napkin. "If this moment hits you, tell me, who would you trust more? What people say to your face or what their small actions reveal when they think you're not really paying attention?" Mark set the envelope back on the table like it weighed nothing and reached instead for the carving knife. "We'll take a look at it later, Dad," he said, a hint of impatience leaking through his polite tone. "Let's just eat while everything's hot, okay?" Lily nodded and slid her phone screen side down beside her plate. Vanessa raised her glass of sparkling cider, offering a strained smile that didn't quite light up her eyes as she murmured, "Merry Christmas," trying to toast over a silence none of them really understood. Henry didn't lift his glass right away. His gaze stayed locked on the envelope, small and fragile among the glittering decorations and steaming dishes, like a single match lying in a room full of dry wood. They truly had no idea how much weight those few ounces of paper carried, how many sleepless nights and lonely mornings lived between its creases. How could they? They hadn't heard the doctor say the word progression. They hadn't watched the nurse quietly circle dates on his chart when they thought he was asleep. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, softening the edges of the world beyond the frosted window. And while everyone reached for dinner, not one of them realized that by the time dessert arrived, that single wrinkled envelope would change who sat at this table next Christmas, and what the word family meant to every one of them. Henry's hand lingered near the envelope long after everyone else had begun eating. The warmth of the dining room contrasted with the hollow chill inside his chest. He chewed slowly, more out of habit than hunger, tasting none of the flavors Vanessa was so proud of. The fork felt heavy in his grasp, as if each bite required courage he wasn't sure he had left. As the conversation drifted around him, work stories, holiday sales, school assignments, his mind slipped somewhere else entirely. He wasn't in this neatly decorated suburban home anymore. He was standing in the old Caldwell kitchen decades earlier, watching Marie hum to herself while shaping dough for Christmas morning cinnamon rolls. She always added extra sugar for Mark, because boys need sweetness more than they admit, she'd say, tapping his nose with flour. Henry remembered how small Mark used to look sitting on the counter, his legs swinging as he watched his mother cook. The boy had asked questions nonstop. Why does cinnamon taste warm? Why do grown-ups kiss? Why does Santa use reindeer? Henry would laugh as Marie tried to answer each one with enthusiasm. Back then their home had felt like a heartbeat, steady, warm, alive. Back then being a father had been the easiest job in the world. But memory had a cruel way of shining brighter than reality. The kitchen where they once danced on linoleum floors now belonged to another family, sold after Marie passed, and Mark insisted Henry didn't need the burden of maintaining an old house. Henry had agreed at the time, emotionally numb, unable to cling to anything other than his grief. Now he wondered whether letting go of that house had been the first quiet step toward becoming a guest in his own family's life. He blinked back to the present, listening as Vanessa complained about holiday travel prices. Her voice buzzed like static, distant and sharp. "We should have just booked the Florida trip earlier," she said. "But with your dad here, we couldn't exactly leave." The subtle bite in her tone wasn't lost on Henry. It never was. Sometimes the things people didn't say were louder than anything that left their mouths. Lily finally spoke up in his defense, surprising everyone. "Mom, it's Christmas. Grandpa should be here." She broke a roll in half, steam rising like a small offering of warmth. Henry offered her a gentle, grateful smile. Moments like these, small, sincere, unaffected, were what he lived for now. "Thank you, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice catching just slightly. But even Lily didn't know the whole truth. Henry had never told her, or anyone in this room, how lonely the senior home felt at night. The television murmuring in the hallway, the soft shuffling of walkers against the floor, the empty chair in his room where Marie's quilt used to rest. He hadn't told them how he sometimes woke up calling her name, only to realize his voice echoed in a room too small to hold their memories. His mind drifted again, this time to the long walk from the factory during the winter. Mark turned 12. Snow had fallen so heavily the roads were closed, but Henry insisted on getting home anyway. He wanted to be there in time for Mark's school Christmas concert where his son had a solo in Silent Night. He had walked nearly 5 miles in freezing wind, arriving with ice on his coat, but the look on young Mark's face when he spotted his father in the front row had thawed everything instantly. Those were the moments Henry kept replaying, over and over, like old film reels spinning in the dark. The times he had showed up. The times he had sacrificed quietly, not for applause or gratitude, but because love had meant action, not convenience. He wondered if Mark remembered any of it, or if adulthood had overwritten childhood with newer, louder worries. A subtle ache pressed behind Henry's ribs as he thought about the letter inside the envelope. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It wasn't written to punish. It was the truth, carved softly and painfully about a father who had given everything he had, and a family that had slowly forgotten what it felt like to truly hold someone close. Have you ever seen someone hide their pain just to avoid burdening the people they love? The narrator's voice could have whispered. If you have, tell me in the comments. Did they ever allow themselves to be seen? Mark finally looked up from the carving board, his voice steady and practical. "Dad, you barely touched your turkey. Are you feeling all right?" The question was harmless, maybe even caring, but Henry heard the flicker of fear beneath it. Not fear for him, but fear of responsibility. Fear that something might be asked of him that he wasn't ready to give. Henry folded his napkin slowly, choosing to spare him the truth. "Just thinking, son. Long day, that's all. The room fell back into its soft chatter, forks clinking gently against plates. Henry listened to the rhythm of the evening as though he were already fading into the background. He scanned each face carefully, memorizing details he feared he might not see again next Christmas. The curve of Lily's smile, the faint wrinkle between Mark's brows, the way Vanessa's bracelet chimed whenever she moved. It struck him then. Love sometimes hurt not because it was absent, but because it no longer knew how to reach the places where it once lived. A sudden gust of December wind rattled the window, making the lights on the tree flicker. The movement drew Henry's gaze back to the envelope, still lying untouched near the cranberry sauce. He knew they would open it later, maybe after dessert, perhaps even with impatience, but they wouldn't expect what was inside. Not the letter, not the document, not the truth that had taken him months to gather the strength to share. He remembered the last conversation he had with Marie before she passed. Her voice had been soft, but her words had been sharp enough to cut through decades. "Henry," she whispered, "promise me you won't disappear when I'm gone. Promise me you'll let them see you." He had promised, his hands trembling around hers. But tonight, he wondered whether all he had done was become invisible in a different way. Lily nudged her father. "Dad," she whispered, "shouldn't we let Grandpa talk about whatever that is?" She nodded toward the envelope. Her voice held the kind of intuition only teenagers still possessed, the ability to notice what adults pretended not to see. Mark hesitated, glancing at Henry, at the envelope, then back at his daughter. But before he could respond, something else happened. A sound broke the rhythm of the room, a sound none of them were expecting, a sound that pulled Henry out of his memories and back into the present with a jolt. The doorbell rang. Once, twice, slow, heavy, like someone at the door carried news that didn't belong to a Christmas night. Mark exchanged a puzzled look with Vanessa. Who would be here this late? He muttered, wiping his hands on a napkin as he pushed back from the table. Henry's spine tightened. A cold ripple crawled through him, deeper than the December wind could reach, because he knew exactly who could be standing outside, and why. But he also knew something else, something the others would only realize in a matter of moments. Someone had come tonight, someone who wasn't supposed to show up, and what Mark heard when he opened that door froze him in place. Mark walked toward the front door with the cautious steps of someone expecting a neighbor, a delivery, or maybe even a late Christmas visitor. But something about the heaviness of the knocks didn't feel friendly or accidental. The house, filled moments earlier with the clinking of silverware and soft murmurs, fell into a tense silence. Even Lily paused her restless tapping, her fork frozen halfway to her lips. Henry shifted in his seat, his breath growing thin. He knew that knock. It wasn't loud, but it carried purpose. Slow, deliberate, like the person on the other side wasn't there by chance. His fingers tightened around the arm of the chair as old memories rose like a tide he couldn't stop. "Please," he whispered internally, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, fate, God, or Marie. Mark peered through the peephole, expecting maybe a caroler or someone selling last-minute baked goods, but instead he stepped back abruptly, confusion twisting across his face. He unlocked the door slowly and opened it only halfway. Cold December air spilled into the house, brushing past his legs and carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something unreadable. On the porch stood a woman in a long gray coat, her hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, her gloved hands folded in front of her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't holding gifts, cards, or anything festive. Her badge, partially visible beneath her coat, glinted under the porch light. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Is Henry Caldwell here tonight?" Vanessa rose from her chair as if pulled by an invisible thread. "Is something wrong?" she asked, crossing her arms tightly against the cold. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying a fear she didn't want to show. Lily looked between her parents, wide-eyed, sensing the unfolding storm but unable to understand its shape. Mark's gaze darted to his father, who sat rigidly at the table, suddenly looking far smaller than the man who had raised him. "Dad," Mark whispered, the word trembling at the edges. Henry inhaled deeply, his chest rising in a slow, resigned arc. He knew this moment was coming, just not tonight, not here, not in front of the people who had stopped seeing him clearly years ago. The woman stepped forward, her boots crunching lightly against the frost on the porch. "Sir, my name is Officer Reyes," she said, keeping her tone gentle but professional. "I'm with the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department. We've been trying to reach you." She paused, scanning the faces in the doorway. "Your phone has been turned off." The sentence felt like a blow Mark hadn't braced for. Why would the Sheriff's Department need to reach him? He demanded, though his voice carried more fear than anger. Vanessa wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing anxiously. "Henry doesn't get into trouble," she insisted quickly, almost defensively. "He barely leaves the senior home." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Every second stretched like a fraying rope beneath his weight. "Officer Reyes," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Has there been news?" The officer looked at him with the kind of compassion that always precedes something painful. Her breath hung in the air like a soft cloud before she answered. "There was an incident at the senior residence this afternoon," she said. "A medical emergency involving one of your closest friends, Mr. Caldwell. His emergency contact information listed you." She hesitated just long enough for dread to seep in. "We didn't want you to hear it secondhand." Lily's hand flew to her mouth. "A medical emergency? Was someone hurt?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. Mark looked at his father with renewed worry, realizing there were entire parts of Henry's life he knew nothing about, parts he had never asked about, parts he had never cared to understand. Officer Reyes continued, softening her tone even further. "His name is Arthur Whitman. Does that sound familiar?" Henry nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. Arthur wasn't just a friend. He had been Henry's closest companion since Marie's death, a widower who had lived across the hallway at the senior home. They had eaten breakfast together every morning, played cards on Thursday nights, and watched late-night reruns of old westerns when insomnia kept them both awake. The officer's eyes softened. "Mr. Whitman suffered a severe stroke around 3 p.m., she said. "He was taken to Mercy Hospital, and the doctors asked that you be notified immediately." She paused. "They don't expect him to make it through the night." A fragile quiet spread across the living room, sinking into the walls, the carpet, the very air they breathed. Henry's breath stuttered, grief visibly cracking through the mask of calm he had forced himself to wear all evening. His hands trembled openly now, no longer able to hide the truth. He looked at the envelope on the table, then back at Officer Reyes, and then at his family, who stared at him like he had become a stranger. "I should have been there," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have been with him." Tears welled in his eyes, not loud, not dramatic, just soft and deeply human. Vanessa stepped toward him, but only halfway, unsure of what comfort she was allowed to offer. "Henry," she said quietly, "you didn't know. You couldn't have known." But Henry shook his head slowly. "Arthur was alone," he said. "I promised I wouldn't let anyone else I cared about die alone." His voice cracked on the last word, scraping against years of buried grief, guilt, and silent longing. "Not again," he added in a whisper. Officer Reyes stepped inside just enough to offer him a card. "If you want to see him," she said, "you should come soon." She glanced at Mark. "We can arrange transport if necessary." Mark swallowed hard, torn between the dinner table, his father's trembling form, and the officer standing solemnly in their doorway. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the guilt coil through him like a tightening knot. "Dad," he said softly, "I can drive you, if you want." "See." His words held sincerity, but also an unspoken question. Why hadn't I known about any of this? Henry hesitated, his gaze drifting again to the envelope lying untouched on the table. Everything inside it suddenly felt even heavier, more urgent, more fragile, more final. He had written those words believing he still had time, but maybe time had been slipping through his fingers far faster than he'd realized. He blinked hard, clearing the blur of tears. "I need to go," he said, pushing himself up from the chair with slow, deliberate motions. "I need to say goodbye." His voice trembled, but his resolve did not. Vanessa reached out as if to steady him, but he shook his head gently. "I'm all right," he murmured. "Just older than I used to be." Lily rose quickly, her expression earnest. "I want to go too," she said, surprising everyone. "Grandpa shouldn't have to face this alone." Henry's eyes softened at her words. She was the only one who didn't make him feel like a burden tonight. If you ever ignored a warning your heart tried to give you, the narrator could have whispered to the viewers, "What did it cost you?" Share it in the comments. Your truth might help someone else. Mark grabbed his coat, slipping into his shoes with hurried movements. "Let me get the car started," he said, pushing past Officer Reyes with determination. Vanessa followed him with her eyes but didn't move to join. Her hesitation hung in the air like smoke, thin, visible, bitter. Henry reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. He held it for a long moment, weighing it in his palm, unsure whether to bring it with him or leave it behind. It contained truths meant for a family who had forgotten how to look at him closely. But tonight, something else felt more urgent. The last chance to show up for someone who had never treated him like an inconvenience. He placed the envelope gently back on the table. "When I come back," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "they'll read it." He turned toward the door, each step slow but steady, carrying years of love, regret, and unspoken stories. Officer Reyes stepped aside to let him pass. Snowflakes drifted past the porch light like tiny falling stars, landing softly on Henry's coat. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His heart was too full, too heavy, too fragile. He stepped into the night. And as Mark pulled the car up, headlights slicing through the falling snow, Henry had no idea that someone else, someone who was not in that house, someone who knew far more than they should, was already watching. And that person had their own copy of the envelope. The drive to Mercy Hospital was quiet. The kind of quiet that hummed louder than any Christmas carol on the radio. Snow blurred the edges of the road, and the wipers swept in a nervous rhythm. Henry sat in the back seat beside Lily, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Every few seconds he glanced at Mark's eyes in the rearview mirror and wondered if his son could feel how fragile this night really was. Lily watched her grandfather carefully, noticing each small movement. The way his breath caught when an ambulance passed, the way his shoulders tensed as they drove by the exit for the senior home. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "how long have you known Mr. Whitman?" Her voice broke the silence like a gentle knock, not demanding, only inviting him to let her in. Henry exhaled slowly, his gaze following the snowflakes streaking past his window. "About 5 years," he said. "He moved into the room across from mine after his wife passed. Some people become family long after the world has decided they're just strangers." Mark's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't known the friendship was that deep. To him, Arthur had just been a name mentioned once or twice in passing. A quiet shock ran through him as he realized there were entire chapters of his father's life that had continued without him. Chapters written in cafeteria conversations, shared medications, and late-night card games. He pictured his father laughing in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, sharing stories with a man Mark had never bothered to meet. For the first time, he wondered what else he had missed while he was too busy. And the thought sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow or spit out. Mercy Hospital loomed ahead, its glass entrance glowing in the winter dark like the mouth of an unwelcome truth. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. Nurses in festive scrub tops moved quickly through the halls. Santa hats perched above tired eyes. Christmas lights framed the nurses' station, but they only made the harsh, fluorescent bulbs feel even more unforgiving. At the front desk, a nurse wearing a reindeer headband looked up as they approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice kind but clipped by a long shift. Henry leaned against the counter, one hand braced for balance. "I'm here to see Arthur Whitman," he said. "They called me. I'm his emergency contact." The nurse's expression softened immediately as she tapped at her keyboard. "He's in ICU, room 412, she said quietly. "We're allowing visitors, but only 2 at a time. If you want to say goodbye, now would be the time." Lily instinctively slipped her hand into Henry's, her fingers warm and steady around his. "We'll go with you," she said quickly. Mark swallowed hard and glanced toward the elevator. "I'll wait in the visitors' lounge if they can only take two," he offered. "You and Lily should go first." For a moment Henry simply looked at him, surprised by the unexpected tenderness in his voice. "If you've ever wished you'd shown up sooner for someone," the narrator might have asked the viewers softly, "what held you back? Be honest in the comments." Mark felt the question land on him like a weight, because for the first time all night he couldn't hide from the fact that his father had needed him long before this drive to the hospital. The hallway to ICU seemed longer than it really was, lined with closed doors and hushed conversations that sounded like half-finished prayers. When they stepped into room 4I-12, the light was dim, coming mostly from a small lamp in the corner and the glow of monitors. Arthur lay in the bed, his once booming laugh now replaced by the steady hiss of oxygen. Tubes and wires framed his body like a fragile web, making him look impossibly small beneath the thin hospital blanket. Henry moved closer, his vision blurring. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's me. It's Henry." He reached for his friend's hand, startled by how cold it felt. "You stubborn old mule," he murmured, a tear slipping free. "You couldn't wait a few more days?" For a moment Arthur seemed too far away to hear, and then his eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitching weakly in Henry's grasp. With great effort his eyes found Henry's face, and the faintest ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "About time," he rasped. Arthur's gaze drifted to Lily, then back to Henry. "That's your girl?" he croaked, his voice thin but warm. Henry nodded, pride cracking through his grief. "My granddaughter," he said. "The one I told you about. The one who still remembers I'm alive." Lily stepped closer, her eyes shining through the sting of tears. "Hi, Mr. Whitman," she whispered. "Thank you for being there for my grandpa." Arthur's eyes glistened. "Good girl," he breathed. "Don't lose her." His chest hitched, and for a second they feared those might be his last words. But another shallow breath came, and he swallowed, forcing out more. "Henry, did you give them the letter?" The question sliced through the room more sharply than any monitor alarm. Henry froze. The machines, the hallway, even the sound of Lily's breathing seemed to fall away. "Not yet," he admitted, shame pressing on every syllable. "It's on the Christmas table. They barely noticed it was there." Arthur's lips twitched in a tired echo of the smirk he wore when they joked about ungrateful relatives over lukewarm coffee. "Figures," he muttered. "You promised me, remember? When we met with that lawyer downtown, you said you'd stop waiting for them to see you before you believed you mattered." Lily's head snapped toward her grandfather. "Lawyer?" she repeated, her voice thin with surprise. "Grandpa, what lawyer? What promise?" Henry had imagined telling his family in a calm setting, with careful words and time to breathe. Not here, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye. Arthur was past the luxury of timing. He changed it, he whispered hoarsely, eyes burning with fragile urgency. "The will, the money, the accounts. He left them a letter, not a prize. He finally made them work for love." Lily stared at Henry, her mind racing. "Is that true?" she asked. "Did you really change everything?" Henry didn't look away from her. "I changed it because I decided to leave my life to the people who actually showed up for it," he said quietly. "To the hands that held mine when the nights were long. To the voices that asked how I was, not just what I could still do for them." The words didn't feel like revenge. They felt like a late, necessary act of self-respect. Arthur gave a faint, approving nod, his breathing shallow and uneven. "About time you stopped apologizing for existing," he whispered. His eyes drifted toward the window, where a smear of winter light bled through the blinds. "Don't back out," he added, voice barely audible. "When they cry, when they beg, don't cave." Henry squeezed his friend's hand, tears falling freely now. "I promise," he said, the vow sinking deep into the quiet space between them. "If this moment makes you think about who truly shows up for you," the narrator might have asked the viewers, "who would be written into your story if love was the only currency? Share it. Your answer might wake someone up." In that dim room, with machines humming and Arthur's breaths growing shallower, a different kind of storm gathered. Henry was no longer just the quiet guest at someone else's table. He was a man who had finally dared to value the years he had given and the love he had offered. Whether his family understood it yet or not, nothing about their future together would be the same. Meanwhile, back in the quiet suburban house with the glittering tree and untouched dessert, the envelope still rested where he had left it, plain and unremarkable among the decorations. Miles away, above a darkened bakery in the city, another light burned late into the night. Attorney Melissa Grant sat at her desk, reviewing a scanned copy of Henry Caldwell's letter and the signed pages of his final will. The changes were unmistakable. Earmarked funds for Lily's education, a donation to the Senior Homes Activities Program, a modest scholarship in Marie Caldwell's name for nursing students who volunteered with the elderly, and only what remained passing to his immediate family. She lingered on his handwritten note at the end. If they are shocked, let it be because of who I chose to honor, not how much there was to take. Just as her phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from Mercy Hospital. Seeing Henry's name on the screen, her stomach tightened with a sudden uneasy weight, because if that call meant what she feared it did, the envelope on the Christmas table might end up being the last voice Henry Caldwell ever had. The hallway outside Arthur's room felt heavier when Henry stepped out, as though grief itself clung to the pale walls. Mark stood up quickly from the visitor's lounge, his face tense with worry. "Is he—" he began, but the question broke apart before it could fully form. Henry shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he whispered, "but it won't be long." Mark swallowed, guilt shadowing his features. He looked down at the floor, then back at his father, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to bridge the years of distance between them. Lily slipped her hand around Henry's arm, steadying him as though she were the one holding him together. "Grandpa was brave," she said softly. "You should have seen him, Dad." They stepped together into the hallway, passing nurses who moved with practiced urgency, pushing carts filled with medications and supplies. Somewhere nearby, a monitor chimed in a rhythmic pattern, echoing like a ticking clock counting down the moments they still had left. Henry felt each sound like a pulse under his skin, sharp and suffocating. He leaned against the wall, letting the coolness steady his shaking limbs. Mark approached cautiously. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking at the edges, "I didn't know you were that close to him. I didn't know he mattered that much." Henry looked at him with an exhaustion that felt older than his years. "You didn't ask," he replied gently, not as an accusation, but as a truth too soft and too sharp to ignore. Mark's breath stuttered as the words sank in deeper than he wanted to admit. Lily looked between them, sensing the fragile tension forming like cracks under their feet. "We can talk about all of that later," she said, squeezing Henry's arm. "Right now, he needs us." Her voice carried a quiet authority, one that made both men fall silent. She led them toward a row of chairs near the window, where snow drifted quietly against the glass, swirling under the hospital's floodlights. Henry sank into a chair, feeling the weight of his body pulled downward like gravity had doubled. The truth about the envelope, the will, the lawyer, it all pressed on him with a suffocating heaviness he couldn't carry much longer. He had expected anger, shock, maybe even betrayal when his family read his letter, but he had not expected this moment, this silent, hungry ache he saw in Mark's eyes, begging for a chance to rewrite years. "Have you ever reached a point," the narrator might have asked, "where you wished you could rewind time, not for yourself, but for someone else? Share your story. Someone listening might need your courage." A doctor approached, clipboard in hand, his face solemn. "Are you all with Mr. Whitman?" he asked quietly. Henry nodded. The doctor's expression softened. "He's stable for now, but it's only a matter of hours. If there's anything you want to say, any closure you need, now is the time." Mark felt a pang of fear rip through him as he looked at his father, an unspoken dread that this stranger's slow departure might mirror his father's one day. When the doctor walked away, Mark lowered himself into the chair next to Henry. "Dad," he began carefully, "about what Arthur said, about the lawyer, Henry closed his eyes, gathering every ounce of strength he had left. "It's true," he said, voice trembling slightly. "I made changes. The envelope on the table explains everything." Mark nodded slowly, but the shock tightened his jaw. "Why?" he asked softly. "Did we fail you that badly?" Henry didn't answer right away. He watched the snow swirling outside the window, each flake drifting slowly downward like a memory falling from the sky. "It's not about failing," he said finally. "It's about seeing, feeling, showing up. I wanted the people who cared to know they mattered to me. I wanted them to have something that reflected the love they gave." His voice wavered. "And Lily, she's the only one who noticed when I was hurting." Lily leaned her head against Henry's shoulder, tears filling her eyes. "Grandpa, I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "I just love you." Henry brushed her cheek gently. "That's all I ever wanted," he said. "Someone who still remembered that I'm here." Mark's face tightened at the words, each one striking a hidden wound he had ignored for far too long. Mark placed a hand on his father's knee, his voice hoarse. "Dad, I never meant to make you feel forgotten. I just thought—" He stopped himself, realizing how thin excuses sounded in the face of unspoken pain. "I thought you were okay. I thought you didn't want to bother us." Henry looked at him with eyes that had seen more winters than Mark could comprehend. "I wanted you to bother," he whispered. "I wanted someone to notice I wasn't okay." The word shattered something inside Mark. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pressing a shaking hand over his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "Dad, I'm so sorry." Henry placed a trembling hand on his son's back, not to comfort him, but to acknowledge the truth finally spoken aloud. Lily looked at them both, eyes red, realizing this was the first time in years they had truly seen each other. As the three of them sat in that fragile circle of grief and truth, a nurse approached, quietly. "Mr. Caldwell?" she said gently. "There's a call for you at the front desk." Henry frowned, confused. "For me?" The nurse nodded. "Yes. The person said it was urgent. They wouldn't leave a name." Henry exchanged a puzzled look with Mark and Lily. "Who would call a hospital to reach me?" he murmured. Lily rose quickly. "I'll walk with you," she said, slipping her hand around his arm again. Together, they moved through the quiet hallway, passing rooms filled with murmured prayers, soft sobs, and flickering televisions. The front desk nurse held out the phone. "They said they knew you personally," she explained. Henry pressed the receiver to his ear. "Hello?" he whispered. For a long moment there was only silence. Soft, steady, almost intentional. Then a familiar voice, low and rough, spoke on the other end. "Henry, I told you I'd call when it started." Henry's body stiffened. Lily saw the color drain from his face. "Who is it?" she whispered urgently. Henry didn't answer immediately. His lips parted, trembling, because the voice on the other end belonged to someone he had never expected to hear from tonight. Someone who wasn't supposed to know about Arthur. Someone who wasn't supposed to know about the envelope. And someone who absolutely wasn't supposed to know about the changes to his will. The voice spoke again, colder this time, almost like a warning. "Don't go back to the house, Henry. You need to hear what they're saying about you." And with those words, the line went dead. The phone slipped slightly in Henry's trembling hand as the line went dead, leaving only the soft hum of hospital static ringing in his ear. Lily watched him with widening eyes, her grip tightening on his arm. "Grandpa, who was that?" she whispered. Henry swallowed hard, forcing air into lungs that suddenly felt too small for his chest. "Someone I haven't heard from in a long time," he replied quietly. "Someone who shouldn't know anything about what's happening tonight." Lily bit her lip, concern knitting her brows together. "But they knew about the envelope," she said. "And Arthur. And the will." Henry nodded slowly, dread pooling deep in his stomach. He couldn't begin to imagine how this mysterious voice had learned details. Only he, Arthur, and Attorney Grant knew. Unless someone had been watching more closely than he realized. They walked back toward the ICU lounge, where Mark stood up the second he saw Henry's shaken expression. "Dad, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Henry lowered himself into a chair before answering. "It was a call," he said. Someone who claimed to know me. Someone who told me not to go back to the house. Mark frowned deeply. Not go back? Why? What kind of call was this? Lily hesitated, then added, They said we needed to hear what people were saying about Grandpa. A dark confusion shadowed Mark's face, but before he could respond, Henry lifted a hand, signaling he needed a moment to think. His thoughts spiraled, weaving between memories and possibilities like tangled threads. Who would warn him? Why now? And then the realization crept in, slow and unwelcome. Secrets rarely stayed buried, especially not when money, wills, and family wounds were involved. Henry leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. But when he opened them again, Lily was watching him with soft determination. Grandpa, she said, whatever this is, we're with you. I'm not letting anyone scare you. For the first time that night, something warm flickered inside him. Small, fragile, but real. Hope, faint and trembling like a candle flame in winter. Mark sat down across from him, rubbing his hands together nervously. Dad, he began, choosing his words carefully. I know tonight's been intense, but if someone's threatening you— Henry cut him off gently. It wasn't a threat, he said. It was a warning. And warnings, they only come from two types of people. Those who want to save you, or those who want to scare you just enough to control you. Mark's jaw tightened. What do you think this was? Henry met his son's gaze, and the decades of distance between them seemed to close by an inch. I don't know, Henry admitted, but someone knows more than they should. The question is, what do they want from me? Lily reached for his hand again, grounding him. Maybe not from you, she said softly. Maybe from what you're leaving behind. Her words struck Henry like a chord struck in a silent room, soft but echoing. The will, the envelope, the letter he had written with shaking hands, pouring out truths he'd kept buried for years. And then a newer, sharper thought pierced through. If someone wanted the family to know too soon, if someone wanted to twist his intentions, the envelope might already be in danger. Henry straightened suddenly, fear slicing through his exhaustion. Lily, he said, did we lock the house when we left? Mark blinked. I think so. Why? Henry shook his head, panic rising in his throat. Because if someone already has a copy of the envelope, they might want the original. Mark felt a chill crawl down his spine. Dad, are you saying someone broke in? Before Henry could answer, a nurse hurried down the hall toward them. Mr. Caldwell, she called, slightly out of breath. The man from room 412? His condition is changing. The doctor wants you to come right away. Henry stood immediately, gripping the armrest for support. Mark stood as well, but Henry held up a hand. Let me go alone first, he said. I need a moment with him. Lily hesitated, then nodded slowly. We'll be right behind you, she said. Henry walked down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. The lights buzzed overhead, their glow reflecting faintly in the polished floor. When he reached Arthur's room, the door was half open, a solemn invitation to the final moments waiting inside. Arthur lay still, his breath shallow, his chest rising in slow, uneven waves. A nurse stood nearby, adjusting the oxygen flow. Henry approached, taking his friend's hand with trembling fingers. I'm here, he whispered. You're not alone. Arthur's eyelids fluttered weakly, and he turned his head slightly toward the sound. Knew you'd come, he rasped, barely audible. Henry squeezed his hand gently. Always, he murmured. I'm sorry I wasn't there earlier. Arthur's expression softened faintly. Doesn't matter, he said. You came now. His gaze flicked toward the window, where snow continued falling gently from the night sky. Henry, remember what we talked about? I remember, Henry said quietly. I won't let them twist my story, or yours. Arthur nodded faintly, eyes glazing with exhaustion. Good, good. Promise me something else. Henry leaned closer. Anything. Arthur swallowed with difficulty. Forgive yourself for the years that hurt. You did your best, better than most. Henry's breath caught in his throat, the words piercing through every old wound he'd carried alone. Arthur's grip weakened, his hand sliding slightly in Henry's. "Thank you for the mornings," he whispered. "And the laughing. And the stupid card games." Henry let out a shaky laugh, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. "You were cheating half the time," he whispered. Arthur's faint smile flickered. "Not half, maybe a third." The monitor beeped softly, then steadied into a slower rhythm. Henry felt Arthur's fingers go still in his hand. The nurse stepped closer, touching Henry's shoulder gently. "He's peaceful," she said softly. "He passed just a moment ago." Henry bowed his head, grief folding him inward like a closing book. "Goodbye, old friend," he whispered. He stayed by Arthur's side for several quiet moments, letting the weight of loss settle around him like snow. And in that silence, deep, fragile, sacred, something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he felt Marie's voice echo softly in his memory. "Promise me you won't disappear." Henry opened his eyes, tears drying on his cheeks. He stood slowly, a new steadiness filling his posture. He knew what he had to do now, not just for himself, but for Arthur, for Marie, and for the part of him that still believed this Christmas could hold something more than grief. When he stepped out of the room, Lily rushed to him at once, wrapping her arms around him. Mark stood just behind her, eyes red but filled with a seriousness Henry hadn't seen in years. "Dad," Mark said quietly, "whatever comes next, we're in this. All of us." For the first time that night, Henry truly believed him. But just as hope flickered through the hallway like a warm ember, Mark's phone buzzed. He hesitated, then answered. A voice spilled through the speaker, a voice they all recognized instantly. Vanessa, except she wasn't calm. She wasn't composed. She wasn't herself. Her voice trembled with panic, sharp and frantic. "Mark, someone broke into the house!" "And the envelope. The envelope is gone." Mark froze, the hospital lights reflecting in his widened eyes as Vanessa's voice spilled out of the phone in sharp, uneven gasps. "Mark, please, come home. Someone broke in. The living room is a mess. The envelope, it's gone." Her breathing hitched. "I think they were looking for it." Henry's heart seemed to stop mid-beat. Lily clapped a hand over her mouth. Mark's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. "Vanessa, listen to me," he said, trying to steady his voice. "Are you safe? Is anyone hurt?" Vanessa inhaled shakily. I wasn't home when it happened. I walked in and everything was thrown around. The drawer by the hallway was open, the windows broken." Her voice cracked. "I don't know who did this, Mark, but they knew exactly what they were looking for." Henry sank into a chair, exhaustion and fear folding through him like a collapsing wave. The envelope, his truth, his goodbye, his last attempt at setting things right, was gone. But more than the loss of the paper itself, something far darker coiled inside him. Someone wanted the truth buried. Someone wanted his voice stolen. Lily knelt beside him. "Grandpa," she whispered, "this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." Henry placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "I just wanted them to know how I felt," he murmured. "I didn't want it to become a war." Officer Reyes approached, her expression shifting quickly from concern to alertness as Mark repeated Vanessa's words. "Someone broke into your home," Reyes asked sharply. "And the envelope is missing?" Mark nodded. "Yes, my wife just called. The windows shattered. They went through our things." Reyes's mouth tightened. "We need to go. Now." She looked at Henry. "Mr. Caldwell, this wasn't random. This is connected to your will." Henry's shock deepened. How could anyone even know? Reyes shook her head. "Because someone was watching." She motioned toward the parking lot. "We'll follow you. But it's better if you ride with us, sir." Mark wanted to argue, wanted to protect his father himself, but Reyes raised a firm hand. "If someone is targeting your father's documents," she said, "he's safer with law enforcement. We don't know who we're dealing with yet." Henry hesitated, then nodded. "Lily," he said softly, "sit with your father. I'll be right behind you." Lily hugged him fiercely before stepping away. Outside, the snow had thickened, blanketing the parking lot in soft white layers. Henry and Reyes got into her patrol car while Mark and Lily climbed into Mark's sedan. As the engines rumbled to life, Henry could feel his pulse echoing in his skull. The night seemed darker than before, the roads narrower, the shadows deeper. On the drive back, Reyes kept her voice steady. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I need to ask you something. Besides you, Arthur, and your attorney, did anyone else know what was in that envelope?" Henry let out a long, weary breath. "I didn't tell anyone," he said. "But Arthur, he mentioned the lawyer downtown, and my family saw the envelope tonight, but they didn't know the details." Reyes nodded thoughtfully. "If someone got a copy of the contents already, they might be trying to remove the original to avoid complications, or to manipulate the message." Henry's brow furrowed. "Manipulate?" "Yes," Reyes said. "If the letter you wrote is emotional, revealing, or contains accusations or criticisms, someone might want to rewrite the narrative before the truth gets out." Henry's pulse quickened. "But who would want to twist my words?" Reyes's jaw tightened. "Anyone who benefits from pretending your final wishes were different from what you wrote." Henry stared out the window, the falling snow blurring into streaks of white. He felt suddenly fragile, not because of his age, but because someone was trying to erase him. When they finally pulled up to the house, Mark and Lily were already outside, waiting. The porch light glowed in the snow, illuminating the shattered window beside the door. Vanessa stood near the steps, wrapped in a coat, her face pale and streaked with tears. Mark rushed forward. "Dad, stay close." He guided Henry toward the house while Reyes moved ahead with her flashlight drawn. The scene inside was far worse than Henry expected. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were open. Papers littered the floor like fallen leaves. The Christmas tree leaned slightly to the side, ornaments scattered across the carpet. But what hit Henry hardest was the sight of the dining table. The centerpiece was cracked. Plates were pushed aside. Cranberry sauce had splattered across the tablecloth, and where the envelope had once rested, there was nothing but an empty space. Reyes scanned the room with trained eyes. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they wanted," she said. "There's no sign they took anything else valuable. They weren't after jewelry, electronics, or cash." She turned to Henry. "Only the envelope." Vanessa shook her head in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why would anyone want something like that? Why take a letter?" Mark swallowed hard. "Unless they didn't want us to read it," he said. "Unless the letter told a story someone didn't want us to know." Henry felt the words cut deeper than any blade. The truth he had tried to deliver gently had now become a weapon in someone else's hands. Reyes knelt beside a torn piece of paper near the table leg. She picked it up carefully with gloves. "This isn't part of your table settings," she observed. "It looks like it was ripped." She held it under the light. Henry's heart lurched. It was the corner of his envelope. The F from "For My Family" was still visible. Lily gasped. "They tore it open here," she whispered. Before taking it, Reyes stood. "Which means they wanted to confirm it was the right item before leaving. Whoever this person is, they had instructions." Mark paced anxiously. "But who?" he demanded. "Who even cares about my father's letter?" Reyes looked between them, her expression grim. "Someone who benefits from your father being misunderstood." Before Mark could respond, a new voice echoed from the doorway. "Or someone who benefits from him being silenced." Everyone turned sharply. Attorney Melissa Grant stepped inside, snow dusting her shoulders, her expression unreadable. Vanessa gasped. Lily took a step back. Mark moved instinctively in front of his father. Reyes's hand hovered near her holster. "Ms. Grant," she said carefully, "how did you know the house was compromised?" Melissa lifted her chin. "Because I've been trying to reach Henry Caldwell all evening." She locked eyes with Henry. "And because I think we're all in more danger than you realize." A tense silence spread through the room. Mark narrowed his eyes. "Why should we believe anything you say?" he demanded. "You already knew too much about our family. And now you show up right after a break-in." Melissa exhaled sharply. "Because I didn't come here to hurt him," she said. "I came here to warn him, and to tell you all the truth before someone else twists it." Reyes stepped between her and the family, her voice firm. Ms. Grant, you need to explain what you know. Melissa nodded, removing a folder from her bag. You're going to want to sit down for this, she warned, because Henry's will isn't the only document someone is trying to change. Henry's eyes widened. What do you mean? Melissa opened the folder slowly. Inside were several papers, legal forms, signatures, financial transfers, and at the very top, a forged version of Henry's new will. Gasps filled the room. Reyes's face hardened instantly. Where did you get this? She demanded. Melissa swallowed. Someone sent it to my office an hour ago, she said. Anonymous, with a note saying, here's the version you'll need if he doesn't make it. Henry staggered back, his breath hitching painfully. Lily grabbed his arm for support. They were planning for you to die tonight, Henry, Melissa whispered. The room erupted. Fear, anger, disbelief all crashing together. Dad, sit down, Mark urged, guiding him to a chair. Lily knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. Reyes stepped forward, her voice sharp. Ms. Grant, you need to tell us everything you know. Now. Melissa nodded, visibly shaken. I can only tell you what I found. My office was broken into yesterday. Files were moved. Copies were made. Someone was looking for Henry's documents, including his will, his letter, and any notes tied to his estate. Mark clenched his fists. So someone wants his money. Melissa shook her head vigorously. No, they want control. She looked straight at Henry. Your real will leaves your estate divided differently. Your letter explains why. That's what they wanted to destroy. Henry swallowed hard. Who would do something so cruel? Reyes answered before Melissa could speak. Someone who wants to rewrite your story before anyone else hears it. She turned to Melissa. You said you received the forged will anonymously, but do you have any idea who might be behind this? Melissa hesitated, then spoke. I think it's someone very close to your family. Silence slammed into the room. Vanessa's eyes widened. What are you implying? Melissa held her gaze for a long, cold second. I'm implying nothing, she said calmly. I'm telling you what I know. She slid one more paper from the folder. A bank transfer authorization form. Signed. With a familiar signature. Too familiar. Henry leaned forward, shock rippling through him. That's my signature. Melissa nodded slowly. Except it isn't. She lifted the paper toward the lamplight. Whoever forged it, they practiced. They studied your hand. They knew your curves, your tremors, your spacing. Reyes stepped closer. This is a serious crime, she said. Do you know who submitted it? Melissa inhaled deeply. It was sent from a device inside this house. Mark stared. Vanessa paled. Lily covered her mouth, horrified. Henry whispered, Inside this family? Melissa's jaw tensed. Someone here tried to transfer your funds before the will could even be read. Reyes's voice dropped to a cold, sharp edge. There's only one question left. Her eyes swept across the room. Who was in this house when the break-in happened? The answer would change everything.